Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're looking at, well, quite a stack of source material. It covers a really complex time involving South Korean intelligence, a pretty controversial religious group, and how all that played out internationally, especially with Japan and the United States.
Right. It's a fascinating mix, isn't it? Power, politics, influence, even deception. We're really digging into how South Korea's domestic scene, particularly its intelligence agency, the KCIA, kind of spilled onto the world stage.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission today is to try and untangle these threads for you. We want to figure out who the key players were, how they tried to exert influence, and, what these sources tell us about that whole period.
And we'll be looking closely at those connections between the KCIA and the Unification Church, Sun Myung-moon's group, and how Japan fits into this puzzle as well. It's quite a story.
Okay, so where do we start? Maybe with the KCIA itself, their footprint in the U.S.
Good place to start. So the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, the
Right.
KCIA, it wasn't unusual for them to have people overseas, just like, the CIA or MI6.
Right.
And the sources point to a significant presence right within the South Korean embassy in Washington, D.C.
And not just, desk jobs, right? These were active operations.
Absolutely. They mentioned the station chief, Yang Do-won, but he was using an alias, Lee Sang-ho, which, was standard practice for KCIA officers working abroad. It signals that covert element right away.
Makes sense.
And their activities went beyond just intelligence gathering. The sources talk about these secret sessions at the embassy.
Secret sessions? What did that involve?
Well, and also surveillance. They had watchdogs, as the sources put it, keeping tabs on certain people. Sometimes it was couched in pleasantries, but the goal was monitoring control.
Okay, so control. And it gets heavier than that, doesn't it? There's the story of Lee Jae-hyun.
Ah, yes, Lee Jae-hyun.
Right.
He attended some of these secret meetings in '73, and the sources say he was subjected to interrogation techniques. Yeah, designed to break him down. He apparently just walked out of one session and never went back to the embassy.
I can't blame him, but that wasn't the end of his involvement.
Not at all. Fast forward 2 years, June 1975. Lee Jae-hyun testifies before the U.S. House International Relations Committee.
And that's where things really came out.
Exactly. His testimony was pretty explosive. He described this detailed plan for those 73 meetings. The KCIA was actively trying to buy off American leaders.
Specifically, Congress members.
Yes, members of Congress were a key target, but also pressuring American businessmen who had investments in Korea. Get them to lobby for the Park Chung-hee regime.
So it was a multi-pronged strategy: bribery, pressure, lobbying, all directed from the KCIA.
A deliberate effort to influence U.S. policy from within. It shows how far they were willing to go.
So why? Why this intense push for influence? We need to look at Korea's history, right? Its position, particularly with Japan.
Absolutely. Korea's location, it's historically been caught between bigger powers, a battleground, really.
The sources mention the Japanese invasions back in the late 1500s, Japan wanting to use Korea as a stepping stone to China.
Right. And internally, Korea's Yi dynasty, it was plagued by factionalism, corruption. It weakened the country significantly.
Which eventually led to Japan gaining control.
Well, a key moment was the Tonghak Rebellion in 1894. The Yi dynasty called China for help. Japan saw this as a threat and reacted.
Leading to the Sino-Japanese War.
Exactly. Japan won, pushed China out, and cemented its dominance. Then, in 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea.
And the colonial period was harsh, trying to suppress Korean identity.
Making them use Japanese names, turning them into second-rate Japanese, as the sources put it. This history is absolutely crucial for understanding South Korea's later sensitivities about sovereignty and, foreign influence.
Which brings us right to Park Chung-hee. His background is really tied up in this period.
It really is. He had military training under the Japanese, even attended the Imperial Military Academy in Tokyo.
And he had to take a Japanese name too, right? Lieutenant Okamoto.
Yes, in 1941. Served in Manchukuo during World War II. That's where he knew Chung Il-kwon, who later became his prime minister. So these connections, these experiences under Japanese rule, they run deep.
After the war, Korea is divided. The U.S. is in the south, and relying on collaborators initially.
Yeah, the American occupation forces, they first leaned on the Japanese who are still there, and then on Koreans who had worked with the Japanese administration.
And Syngman Rhee, the first leader the U.S. backed, his government had many of these former collaborators.
That's what the sources indicate, yes. The backbone of his regime often came from those who'd served the Japanese colonial power. It's a complicated legacy.
And Park Chung Hee himself, he joins the new South Korean military academy.
In 1946. But then there's a twist. He gets involved with communism.
Right. Court-martialed, sentenced to death.
But he saved himself. He exposed the communist network within the army. Hundreds of officers were purged because of his testimony. He was dismissed, but his life was spared.
That tells you a lot about him. Ruthless pragmatism, survival instinct.
Definitely characteristics that shaped his later political career. He eventually seizes power in a coup in 1961.
And he deals with the U.S. right away, doesn't he? Agreeing to keep ROK forces under the UN command.
Yes, reassuring the Americans was a priority. And a key figure in that coup, and in the early days of the regime, was Kim Jong Pil.
Park's relative, right, his niece's husband.
Yes, and a fellow military academy cadet. He was crucial in helping Park consolidate power.
And Kim Jong Pil establishes the KCIA.
He does, the KCIA and the ruling Democratic Republican Party. And here's a really critical link from the sources.
What's that?
Kim Jong Pil, as the first KCIA director, gave the Park regime's official blessing to the activities of Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church.
Wow. So not just turning a blind eye, but an active green light from the intelligence chief.
Exactly. A decision to utilize Moon's group. This connection starts very early.
And the early KCIA, under Kim Jong Pil, they were involved in some shady financial dealings too.
Oh yes. The sources mention profits from stock market manipulation, like $40 million back in 1962, and large kickbacks, particularly from importing Japanese cars.
There's the Japan connection again, woven into the KCIA's funding right from the start.
Seems so. And Park used the KCIA heavily to stay in power, winning elections, partly through their efforts and partly through large forced contributions from businesses.
Including Japanese and American companies.
That's what the sources say. It cemented this pattern of political power being tied up with business interests, both domestic and foreign.
And corruption didn't stop when Kim Jong Pil left the KCIA.
No, it just became maybe more spread out. Park himself apparently kept a large stash of cash in the Blue House, the presidential residence, often supplied by Lee Hoo-rak, his chief of staff.
And used that cash for payoffs.
Paying off politicians, military commanders, basically ensuring loyalty through money.
Okay, so amidst all this political maneuvering, this corruption, South Korea's economy starts booming in the 60s.
Phenomenally so. Over 9% annual growth. It became this great success story.
Which was obviously good for Park politically.
Absolutely. It fed into his strategy. Stay in power, reduce dependence on the U.S. And while American money and advice helped.
The sources emphasized the Korean people themselves.
Right. The educated, industrious, disciplined people were the key factor, though the focus was heavily on industry, sometimes neglecting agriculture.
But it created jobs, raised incomes.
So for many Koreans, it probably felt like they'd never had it so good. It was a powerful narrative for the regime.
But we have to remember the other side. The sources are clear. Corruption, militarism, and dictatorship also happened.
Exactly. The economic growth was happening under an authoritarian government.
Okay, let's pivot back to Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church, and specifically how deep these KCIA ties really were.
Moon himself faced controversy early on, charges in 1955, draft evasion, forgery, but also things like pseudo-religion and false imprisonment.
Those charges were dropped, but it shows he was a controversial figure from the beginning.
Definitely. And his core teaching, the divine principle, has some, well, very challenging aspects.
Like the idea about deception.
Yes.
Yeah.
The idea that deception is okay, even necessary, if the motive is supposedly good. He taught goodness must now deceive evil. And even, quite startlingly, even God lies very often.
Wow, even God lies very often. That's something.
It is. And this concept, later called heavenly deception, is absolutely vital for understanding how the church operated, especially when facing outside scrutiny or engaging in covert activities.
Because if you believe lying to outsiders perceived as evil is religiously justified,
Then denial becomes a strategy, a divinely sanctioned one. It's not just dishonesty, it's a core part of the operational doctrine. And remember, Kim Jong Pil, the KCIA chief, decided back in '62 to use Moon's church.
that official blessing is key.
It really is, and we see KCIA and government people getting directly involved with Moon or promoting his interest.
Like Pak Bo-hai.
Pak Bo-hai, yeah.
Yeah.
He was Moon's sort of advance man, but he was also the assistant military attaché at the Korean embassy in D.C.
Wow.
Dual roles.
And others.
Han Sang-kyuk, a KCIA station chief who later became an ambassador. Han Sang-kyul went from working at the embassy to being Moon's personal secretary. These aren't just casual links.
They seem very deliberate.
And Bo-hai Pak was very active, setting up the church in the U.S., recruiting heavily in Virginia. While they might claim independence on paper, these personnel links and the KCIA blessing suggest a much deeper entanglement.
And Moon used specific tools for influence, right? Like the Little Angels Choir?
Yes, the Little Angels Children's Choir. Moon didn't just see them as performers, he saw them as instruments of influence.
He actually said that.
Explicitly.
Yeah.
After performing in Japan, he said they'd laid the foundation to win the embassy personnel stationed in Japan to our side, and through them we can influence their respective nations.
Targeting diplomats through cultural performance. Again, note the Japan focus there.
Exactly. Another tool was the Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation, or KCFF. It was basically a front group.
And they launched Radio of Free Asia.
ROFA, yes. Anti-communist broadcasts. And here's the kicker. The sources say they got free use of transmitters and studios through the KCIA.
So the state intelligence agency was providing the infrastructure for Moon's propaganda.
Directly. And money. Donations from Americans for ROFA often got diverted.
To the Unification Church itself, or other Moon projects.
That's what the sources indicate. There's the story of Robert Mays, who got involved with the ROFA. He writes a check, gets guided around Seoul with help from the KCIA director at the time, Kim Jong Pil.
Only to find out later about the KCIA link and the money diversion.
Right. He concluded Pak Bo-haen's real loyalty was to Moon, not the ROFA cause itself. It shows how the KCIA connection facilitated these front groups and the misdirection of funds, all arguably enabled by that heavenly deception idea.
Moon also had these anti-communist groups active in Korea and Japan?
Yes, like the International Federation for the Extermination of Communism. He got support from prominent figures in Japan like Ryoichi Sasakawa. Anti-communism was a useful banner.
Okay, so alongside Moon's operations, we have Tongsun Park working the influence angle too.
Right, Tongsun Park. Different approach, maybe.
Yeah.
Wealthy background, U.S. education, used money and charm.
And he got involved in rice deals, big ones.
Very big. He became a key agent for U.S. rice sales to Korea, a role the sources say he got largely thanks to KCIA Director Kim Jong-wook stepping in with the Korean government's Office of Supply.
But then he lost a later contract because people suspected he was working for the KCIA.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? But yeah, the suspicion was there.
He was known for schmoozing Congress members, organizing trips to Korea.
Oh yeah, lavish trips. Big receptions, dignitaries, even using orphan girls for welcoming committees. It was a full-on charm offensive to build connections and, well, obligations.
And the sources mention an unwritten contract with the Prime Minister and KCIA director.
To basically ensure Korea got what it wanted from the U.S. Congress, especially aid money. He targeted specific Congressman Passman, McFall, Hanna, Longer mentioned.
His connections went pretty high up, facilitating meetings with the Secretary of Defense.
Yes. Congressman William Minchell wanted to meet Defense Secretary Laird. Tongsun arranged it. And significantly, a KCIA officer was actually present in those meetings.
That shows incredible access and KCIA oversight. What about Congressman Passman? That relationship sounds complicated.
It does. Passman apparently tried to avoid being seen publicly with Tongsun, but privately, he took his advice and his money.
And Tongsun felt Passman would protect his interests.
He saw Passman as brazen enough to protect my interest. It suggests a pretty cynical understanding on Tongsun's part. And clearly, these activities, fueled by government connections, made Tongsun a lot of money.
Okay, so all this influence peddling is happening while U.S.-Korea relations are maybe a bit rocky.
Definitely under strain at times. The Tet Offensive in '68, for example, it resulted in huge allowances for South Korea, over $1 billion, and lucrative contracts in Vietnam.
Where the ROK government apparently pocketed some of the money meant for troop payments.
The sources suggest they paid their troops less than the U.S. provided, yeah. Then there was the USS Pueblo seizure.
Cyrus Vance went to Seoul to calm things down.
Right, to reassure Park. The deal was, Park promised not to attack North Korea, and the U.S. promised $100 million in military aid. A quid pro quo.
But Park wasn't happy later with President Johnson, halting the bombing in Vietnam.
No, he was dismayed. And Johnson not running again meant Park had to build ties with Nixon. Then Nixon planned troop withdrawals,
which the South Koreans strongly opposed, publicly.
Prime Minister Chung Il-kwon even threatened to resign. A big public display, but behind the scenes.
Park couldn't really stop it.
Despite his fury, the sources say he was ultimately helpless to do anything about the withdrawal, which you could argue probably just increased the motivation to find other ways to secure influence in Washington, like the KCIA operations, like Tongsun Park.
Which leads us to Koreagate, when this all started to become public.
Exactly. The scandal breaks, focusing initially on Tongsun Park's payments to congressmen.
fueled by accusations from people like Park Chung-kyu, another figure close to President Park, and maybe Tongsun's own boasting.
Possibly exaggerated lists, yeah. But the core issue was there. And the U.S. government wasn't entirely unaware before the scandal broke.
There were earlier reports, like about Congressman Gallagher.
Yeah, an intelligence report suggested Congressman Cornelius Gallagher was getting money from a KCIA operative on his staff. J. Edgar Hoover himself sent top-secret eyes-only letters about it.
Top secret! But nothing much happened.
Seems like the FBI didn't pursue it heavily, and there were others who saw pieces of this. Donald Renard at the State Department.
He suspected a broader lobbying plan. Knew about Tongsun and Pak Bodai being KCIA controlled.
Yes, and he pushed for the Justice Department to investigate ROFA, Moon's radio front.
Ambassador Habib, too, he got frustrated.
Oh, Habib, yeah. During his time as ambassador to Korea, he was apparently quite annoyed by Thompson's antics and the whole lobbying push.
So, awareness in different pockets of the U.S. government, but a pattern of inaction.
That's what it looked like. The FBI on Gallagher. State Department requests on KCIA harassment being slow-walked, ignoring reports about efforts to block Kim Dae-jung, Park's opponent, from meeting U.S. officials.
Leading to that feeling, for some Korean Americans, that places like LA felt like a territory of South Korea.
Because of the perceived reach and impunity of the KCIA, there were even gifts given to U.S. officials, though some did return them. It suggests a system not quite equipped or maybe willing to tackle the problem effectively at that time.
Which brings us back to the Moon Organization's role, because the big congressional investigation, the Fraser Committee, it widened its scope, didn't it?
It did. It started looking at human rights, but after Lee Jae-hyun testified about that KCIA plan to buy off, seduce, and intimidate Americans, the focus broadened dramatically.
And the Moon Organization was right in the middle of that.
Explicitly linked. The sources state they were reportedly paid by the KCIA to stage demonstrations.
Like pro-Park rallies against his opponents.
Exactly. Pro-Park, anti-Kim Dae-jung rallies in the U.S., organized and funded, apparently, by South Korean intelligence using the Unification Church as its operational arm.
And Chairman Fraser, who ran the investigation, he didn't even know about this initially.
Not the full extent, no. That the Moonies were essentially running demonstrations for the KCIA.
So the investigation uncovered that Moon's group was seen as one of the 3 pillars of the whole influence campaign.
Right. Alongside Tongsun Park's payoffs and direct KCIA harassment and intimidation. The sources position the Moon Organization as a central, integrated tool of the Park regime's foreign influence strategy.
And Moon's own philosophy, that totalist system where everything can be religion.
That really helps explain it, doesn't it? Owning banks, working for the KCIA, selling weapons, brainwashing. It could all be framed as serving a higher religious purpose within his worldview.
Which made denial easy when they were confronted, using heavenly deception.
Precisely. Spokesmen like Neil Salonen and Bo Hypek consistently denied wrongdoing, denied KCIA money, denied Moon's direct control over the U.S. church operations, often invoking the First Amendment. It was a practiced strategy of denial based on their core doctrine.
But the investigators found evidence to the contrary, especially financial evidence.
Significant evidence. Moon was reportedly taking millions personally each month, and the Diplomat National Bank purchase.
Buying 53% of the stock, using followers' names.
Yes, $1.28 million worth. Using low-ranking Moonies names to get around banking laws that limit ownership by one group. And the money came from all over Japan, Germany, Korea. A global network.
And the bank was meant for moving currency internationally.
That's what Moon apparently intended. Strategic control over finance. Plus their business empire, Tong-el Industries, negotiating contracts for M16 rifles.
So involved in arms dealing too, it's a far cry from just a church.
Very far. But investigating them was incredibly hard. The denial, the resistance to subpoenas. Salonen and Pak were particularly difficult witnesses.
And the official investigations, Justice Department, Congress, they faced major hurdles, especially from the Korean government.
Immense challenges. Paul Michel's team at Justice got Tongsun's records from the IRS. But controversially, without a warrant, Tongsun himself led the country for a while.
And the House Ethics Committee probe, led by Leon Jaworski.
Jaworski, fresh off Watergate. But even he hit roadblocks. Primarily, as the sources put it, the intransigence of the Korean government.
Like with Kim Dong-jo, the former ambassador accused of payoffs.
Exactly. Kim Dong-jo refused point-blank to testify. Wouldn't do it in the U.S., wouldn't do it elsewhere, wouldn't even provide written testimony under oath. Jaworski offered multiple options.
And the Korean government just wouldn't compel him.
Refused to cooperate.
Yeah.
Essentially shielded him.
Then there was that disturbing incident with the KCIA defector, Son Ho-young.
Yes, Son Ho-young tried to defect, but feared for his life because the KCIA got tipped off. Intelligence reports suggested the leak came from within the Fraser subcommittee.
Congressman Derwinski was suspected.
He was. A grand jury even found him guilty based on the intelligence, but that intel couldn't be used in court. The ethics committee eventually closed the case. No disciplinary action.
That's chilling. It shows the risks and the difficulty of getting accountability when powerful interests might be interfering.
Absolutely. And even getting Tongsun Park to testify was difficult. South Korea refused extradition. They eventually agreed he testify in Korea under conditions largely controlled by the ROK government. It limited the value of his testimony.
So after all that, what were the actual results? Few convictions?
Relatively few, considering the scale of it all. Congressman Hanna pleaded guilty, served time the only member of Congress jailed. Hancho Kim, pegged as Tongsun's KCIA successor, got convicted but served a short sentence. Others were investigated but not indicted, often due to lack of admissible evidence.
So who really won in the end? Not President Park, ironically.
Not really. Tongsun and Moon seem to have benefited more. Tongsun regretted the lost income and social status, but avoided serious time. Park kept power through his repressive Yushin Constitution for a while, but was assassinated by his own KCIA director.
And Sun Myung-moon.
Described in the sources as the flourishing survivor. The scandal didn't stop him. He continued operating, taking in millions, expanding his business empire, including those arms deals, and maintaining tight control over his followers.
And kept denying the KCIA links.
Persistently. Moon and his followers mirrored the Park regime's denials, sticking to that heavenly deception playbook.
There was also pushback against calling the Unification Church a cult.
Yes, especially after Jonestown made people wary of the term. Some mainstream church leaders and civil liberties groups objected, which the sources suggest might have inadvertently helped Moon deflect legitimate scrutiny.
And overall, the U.S. government's response, even when evidence surfaced, it was often delayed or inactive.
That's a recurring theme. FBI, Justice, State Department officials, even figures like Kissinger and Speaker Albert. A pattern of reluctance or failure to really pursue the connections between Moon's organization and the Korean government effectively.
So the conclusion seems to be that U.S. support for South Korea continued, but more because of Cold War strategy than because these influence campaigns actually worked.
That's the assessment in the sources, yes. The strategic interest overshadowed the impact of the lobbying and covert actions, even though those actions were extensive.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've traced this really complex web. The KCIA operating in the U.S., trying to buy influence.
The Unification Church acting as a key tool for them, using heavenly deception, front groups like RFA that literally use KCIA facilities, and this global financial network drawing funds from places like Japan.
Individuals like Tongsun Park playing the lobbyist game with cash and connections. And all this happening against that historical backdrop of U.S.-Korea ties and the shadow of Japan.
The sources really do connect all these dots. The intelligence agency, the controversial religious group using deception, the lobbyists showing how they were part of a larger state-sponsored influence operation, and how hard it was to investigate effectively.
So maybe the final thoughts leave you with, drawn from this material, is that real, lasting influence might not just come from the obvious stuff like bribes.
Right. Perhaps it's more about exploiting systems, using deception strategically, and hiding controversial activities behind legitimate fronts like religion, like business.
That approach, as we've seen here, can stall investigations, allow key players to deny everything, and ultimately let them continue operating, sometimes even thriving, long after the scandal seems over.
So what does that pattern unearthed from this specific historical episode tell us about the challenges we still face in monitoring and countering foreign influence today?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.